Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Myths of Identity and the Rise of Adolescent Society. Here we have our present age, bent on the extermination of myth. Man today, stripped of myth, stands famished among all his pasts and must dig frantically for roots. Friedrich Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy. There can be no stronger proof of the impoverishment of our contemporary culture than the popular, though profoundly mistaken, definition of myth as falsehood. Rollo May, The Cry for Myth. Hi everyone, and this is a matching or a development of the thumbnail image for the pride flag. So if you can just study it for a little bit and I'll give you the explanation as per official channels. So this is the two-spirit pride flag. It was created in March 2024 by Boy Chris, it's a pseudonym I'm assuming, Christopher Hamill, founder and president of the Leather Boys of Houston for the two-spirit individuals of the LGBTQIA+ community. This represents the spirit of the two-spirit individuals in the leather kink communities. Big shout out to all you leather kinkists, if that's the correct collective noun, in North America and around the world. So I'm going to try not to impose my judgments on the whole hot button topic of identity. And you're never going to keep politics out of a channel about art and stuff. It's always going to creep in some shape or form. But I wanted to try and I'm hoping there's some across the spectrum agreement that whatever your views about gender identity, it's a hugely topical issue that causes a lot of contention and heat. And rather than just go round and round in circles, which a lot of online forums seem to do, I wanted to go behind, just take it as a given that it's a huge issue, but ask why. Why is it in the recent years has it become such an issue? And I'm going to make two main arguments. One is I'm going to suggest, perhaps quite tangentially to most people's perspectives, I'm going to suggest that the lack of myth and the lack of fairy tales for children, and by extension the whole theme of this channel, the lack of art and literature, has thrown people back upon themselves. They haven't got these guiding narrative structures. And even though people may think art, literature, myths, fairy tales, they're all just peripheral, they're not a major part of society's structure, human beings have used them for thousands of years, until relatively recently. And we've substituted them with popular culture in the form of mass media entertainment, social media. And what that creates, I'm going to argue, is a permanently adolescent society. And one feature that I'm going to explore is part of this adolescent mentality seems to me the rejection or the cancelling of history. Anything that's happened that demonstrates values that aren't the current values is people refuse to consider it, or they condemn people from the past for not living as they do today, which strikes me as the definition of bovine stupidity. But we'll see as we go along how convinced you are. So this was the definition of the two-spirit pride flag. And I think, not that I'm objecting to it, like I say, I'm going to try and keep a straight face for most of this. But, you know, this phrase, drill, baby, drill, it strikes me that we've drilled down into the notion of identity so deep now. It's becoming so specific, so inclusive of very narrow types. There seems to be a sub-genre and a subcategory for absolutely everyone. But the corollary of that is shared culture. The idea of something that appeals to everyone is increasingly rare as hen's teeth. So what are the causes of that? What are the implications of that? And that's what I'm going to look at now. So, the concept of psychological maturity. There's this was written, I'm trying to remember, The Uses of Enchantment by Bruno Bettelheim was written in 1976. And he died in 1990, I think. So basically, most of the 20th century, middle of the 20th century onwards, he was active. He was a psychologist, quite a controversial figure in some ways. He escaped from the Holocaust, but was accused of plagiarism and was accused of inventing aspects of his qualifications. But irrespective of all that, I find him quite a fascinating writer. And The Uses of Enchantment is about specifically the importance of fairy tales in the psychological development of young kids. Now, this issue of psychological maturity, therefore, this is what I want to develop, the idea that we've somehow hit a stasis whereby young people, children, feel the world quite intensely and they explore the world through play. Older people who can, like me, quite jaded, but you still, or I did, experience the world or a focus for your world through work. And it's adolescents who are in this hinge point of life where they don't play as intensely as children, and they haven't got a career that they can devote themselves to, and they're going through puberty, their brain is changing, their hormones are raging. So it tends to be an incredibly self-conscious and maybe not self-reflective, but much more self-conscious and almost paranoid period of people's lives. And I'm suggesting that for various reasons, it's almost like the whole of society has become more adolescent. It's become, rather than a stepping stone into adulthood, adults are behaving like adolescents, and adults are indulging the adolescent mentality. And there are structural factors, so people live at home for longer, children don't leave home because of they can't afford a house, and various things, that people are less independent. But part of it does seem to be a social shift, and I've witnessed personally the way people treat their children when they're no longer children, that they're at the very least young adults, but mostly they would have been called adults in the past, but they're treated as young, almost young children, but at least as children. The university system which I left, it became a creche. It became like daycare for children. The infantilization of the education process was so bad, but I risk going off on one. So just to talk about psychological maturity in the terms of Bettelheim's notion of fairy tales. In child or adult, the unconscious is a powerful determinant of behavior. When the unconscious is repressed and its content denied entrance into awareness, then eventually the person's conscious mind will be partially overwhelmed by derivatives of these unconscious elements, or else he is forced to keep such rigid, compulsive control over them that his personality may become severely crippled. So that's one aspect, the notion of how we relate to our unconscious. And Bettelheim claims, I think quite convincingly, that fairy tales told to children at a very young age actually help children engage with their unconscious impulses. And one epiphany I've had recently, and it's been an undercurrent, but I don't think I've spelt it out particularly explicitly in this channel. I have alluded to the way in which art and literature can often be enigmatic and ambiguous. And I have, to some extent, emphasised how I think that's a strength. But it wasn't until rereading Bettelheim recently that I focused on the notion that our society is nearly exclusively devoted to explanation and explaining things. And people want explanations. Whereas fairy tales and myth, and by extension art, literature, paintings, the fact that they offer enigma and they resonate with you rather than explain definitively, there's room for interpretation, there's room for ambiguity. And the beautiful things, according to Bettelheim, with fairy tales is often children don't fully understand why they're responding to the fairy tale, but it has resonance with them. And they can be scared, they can be entranced, they can have various responses. And often they're not quite sure of the purpose of the fairy tale. And it's baked in to the structure of fairy tales or the forms they take. So later on, I'll be mentioning Little Red Riding Hood. And that has so many, when you look into it, so many different variations. And we now today, if to the extent that anyone bothers reading fairy tales to their children, we've got very sanitized versions, whereas the original folk tales are dark. And even the ones that some children were exposed to are quite dark. And that's one aspect of fairy tales, is that kids can be scared by them, but ask for more. It's real. So to cut a long story short, Bethlehem's basically suggesting that kids engage with fairy tales in quite an ambiguous way, but that's good because it helps with their psychological maturity. And I'm suggesting, talking about the rise of adolescent society, that we're now in a society that misses things like these stepping stones towards full psychological maturity. So we've infantilized a whole generation. And rather than that just being a bald claim of mine, there's lots of evidence about the rise of mental illness, specifically amongst adolescents. So I think it's Jonathan Haidt with his book, The Anxious Generation, and he provides the statistics and the social science evidence for this idea that younger people have never been so anxious. So on the one hand, you could say, oh, Paul, you're moaning, you've got to be in your bonnet about art and literature. That's fine. But I'm not the one who's claiming mental illness or constantly saying I've got mental health issues, as young people increasingly do. And that is, I'm not trying to make just a crude correlation between the complete breakdown of access to literature and myth and things and mental illness. But there does seem to be, from the Christopher Lasch was writing about the mid-20th century onwards, this increasingly, the association you can make between affluenza and various forms of mental illness. So, so-called primitive tribal people, they may have many obstacles in life, limited technology, quite profound levels of poverty by Western standards, but you don't often get loneliness or mental anxiety. They don't have time for those things. So to the extent to which mental illness can be an aspect of affluenza is something that I think is an aspect of this, the failure to reach psychological maturity. So he goes on to say, to find deeper meaning, one must become able to transcend the narrow confines of a self-centered existence. So this concept of transcendence is what you get from art, literature, fairy tales, myth. And I think without these sources of transcendence, these things that help us go beyond ourselves, you get the two-spirit flag phenomenon, where people dig deeper and deeper and deeper into their own self-conscious, in a very narrow, self-absorbed type of way, which I just really don't think is particularly healthy. And I'm going to look at Michael Urton in future because he's an artist. And he died in 1975. I think he was born 1921, so he didn't... he died tragically young. He was an amazing artist, and I'm going to show today a couple of images from him. But in the future, in his last 20 years of his life, I think, he became obsessed with the myth of the Minotaur. And this is a novel I'm quoting from, The Maze Maker, which I heartily recommend. It's a brilliant study of Daedalus and Icarus. Daedalus was the inventor of the labyrinth, the designer of it, for King Minos, and the concept of the Minotaur. And it's a brilliant, brilliant novel, which I went into it with low expectations because he was mostly a visual artist, but annoyingly, he also wrote, I think it's a brilliant novel. But this is an excerpt, and he's actually talking about here the court at Knossos in Crete, so the court of King Minos. And so I'm taking it slightly out of context, but I think this has relevance to this digging deep into our self-absorbed nature now, this constant redefinition of identity all the time. So he says, with reference to the court at Knossos, The price of this concentration upon minute distinctions of ritual and the absorption in endless discussion of these niceties is not immediately apparent, but it is a heavy one. She is gradually absorbing her own core by continually abrading it with intensive self-examination. And I just think that's a beautiful quotation that alludes to the danger if all you do it is in a self-absorbed fashion, constantly redefine your own identity. I like this idea, you're basically abrading it. It's like rubbing it with a piece of pumice stone until there's nothing left. And to give you an example, so rather than just be negative all the time, which is my speciality, what I'm now going to do, if you'll bear with me, is just read, because I want to show, I'm claiming that literature and art and myth and fairy tales offer something different. But if you're thinking in this terms of identity, and people have become increasingly self-absorbed and obsessed with, you know, the LGBTQ plus, the whole list, which I just find exhausting apart from anything else. But I'm going to quote you one of the stories in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and it's the story of the nymph Salmacis, and a character who, the name gives it away, what actually happens to him. I say him, but he's called Hermaphroditus. We get the modern term hermaphrodite, meaning having the sexual organs of both male and female. But well, I'll show you the actual image before I keep wittering on. So this is a painting. It's from Book 4 of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and this is the painting by Rupert Bunny. So the nymph of Salmacis. And just to give you the context from the bit I'm going to read, I'm just going to read the last 20 or 30 lines from the story, which isn't particularly long. But basically, Hermaphroditus is the boy on the left, and he's sexually quite shy, and he wants to just be left alone. So there's a lot of, there seems to be a surplus of limpid, completely abandoned pools on a summer's day in Ovid's Metamorphoses. But he finds this pool, and he strips off to go for a little swim. And Salmacis she's quite a randy old nymph, and she takes a liking to him and basically wants to seduce him, and he refuses. So when he dives into the pool naked, she jumps in after him. I never met any adolescent women like this at that age, but she then starts writhing around with him. And it's at this point I'm picking up the narrative. So this is from Book 4, Ovid's Metamorphoses, the story of Salmacis. So this is Hermaphroditus. He fought and struggled, but she wrapped herself around him as a serpent caught by an eagle, borne aloft, entangles coils around head and talons, or as ivy winds around great oaks, or an octopus extends its prey within its tentacles. He refused her the joy she wanted most, but still she held him, body to body. He would not escape her, fight as he may. "Oh, grant me this," she cried in prayer to the gods. "May no day ever come to separate us." And they heard her prayer, and the two bodies seemed to merge together, one face, one form, as when a twig is grafted on parent stock, both knit, mature together. So these two joined in close embrace, no longer two beings, and no longer man and woman, but neither, and yet both. Hermaphroditus saw that the water had made him half a man, with limbs all softness. He held out his arms, lifted a voice whose tone was almost treble, pleading, "O father and mother, grant me this. May everyone hereafter who comes diving into this pool emerge half man, made weaker by the touch of this evil water." It was granted, that prayer, and ever since that day, the waters hold that contamination. So quite a racy little story. what I found, why I wanted you to hear it, is it strikes me that Ovid's Metamorphoses is just one example of how classical literature deals with gender fluidity almost as a matter of course. It's an organic part of the narrative. And Ovid's Metamorphoses, it's riddled with these writhing snake-like images of identity constantly changing, hence the name Metamorphoses. So just off the top of my head, the mother Liriope, the mother of Narcissus, asks a blind seer called Tiresias, what will her son Narcissus have a long life? And he says, not unless he learns to know himself, which is a pastiche or a parody on the Delphic maxim, know thyself. But he, Tiresias, has lived as a man and a woman, because this is how the stories, the myths just build upon each other. He saw a couple of big snakes copulating, and for some reason, I think, hit them with a stick, and as punishment was turned into a woman. Then a few years later saw the same snakes, and the old stick trick worked, and he was changed back into a man. So this fluidity, it's part of narratives. It's not fetishized as it is today and turned into these rigid categories. But also in that story, and this, I don't know whether I'm being delusional, but it just strikes me, it's a bit of ancient Greek, Roman Ovid writing the rewriting the Greek classics for a Roman audience. But it's Roman sense of humour, because without getting too graphic or rude, crude maybe, men, when they go into cold water, there are certain physiological effects, allegedly. And it reminds me, so there's a sense of humour in the end of the story, what a cold pool will do to men, which Hermaphroditus picks up on. But it reminds me, and forgive me, this is only relevant to an audience of a certain age who remember the Seinfeld series on TV. But there's an episode in which he's a very funny character, George Costanza. He's just been in the swimming pool, and he takes his trunks off, and an ex-girlfriend pokes her, I think it's an ex-girlfriend, or a woman he's interested in, pokes her head through the door and sees him naked. And he belatedly realises, as she laughs and runs out the room, that she's seen him in a slightly diminished form. And he laments, I was in the pool, which was just a long-winded way of saying I'm trying to bring Ovid's Metamorphoses into a more modern context. But it just amuses me, the sense of humour and the perspicacity of these tales. So this notion of, if not George Costanza, then the adolescent society's cry for myth, its need for myth. So I'd suggest that today's, why I claim there's a rise to the status of an adolescent society, there are various paradoxical symptoms present. So we have fluid gender identity, but my gosh, people insist upon it quite rigidly. It just seems to be the most rigid insistence upon everyone having fluid identity. I've mentioned it earlier, the rejection of history. We seem to live in an eternal now. And I'll talk about the concept. I've talked about time before, especially endlessly with reference to Proust à la recherche de temps perdu. But this idea that we've lost the ability to think of time in a transcending, imaginative way. We live in a constant now, which is fine if you're a dog, which is something I like about dogs. They live in a constant now. But I think as human beings, we should aspire to something higher. We should be able to transcend our current situation once in a while. And then there's virtuous intransigence, this idea that virtue signalling is another way of thinking about it. But people are insistent, intransigent about showing people how virtuous they are, to the extent that they become deeply intolerant and quite nasty about it, which strikes me as vaguely ironic. So what are the potential causes of this? I'm arguing that the lack of myth is, like I keep saying, by extension, art and literature, that's one potential cause. So disenchantment, it's Bettelheim in his book, The Uses of Enchantment, is suggesting enchantment, fairy tales, myths, literature, they have a very useful function. They help us see the world as an enchanted place. The corollary of that is the Disneyfication, the disenchantment. Children aren't allowed to be scared. Everyone has to have the best of intentions in Disney stories now. I gave an example from Alice in Wonderland in a previous video with the original, I think it was the red pill, blue pill video, where the bread and butterfly and various images from the original Alice stories are quite, not disturbing necessarily, but quite discombobulating. And I think Bettelheim, or no, there was another psychoanalyst I was reading saying he was training various psychotherapists, and he asked them to read the Alice stories so they could discuss them in class. And these are all adults. They were all saying that they wouldn't let their children read them. They found the stories quite disturbing. And this, I think this is a trend, and I think Bettelheim talks about it, that children, to some extent, scaring them within reason is a healthy thing to do. And I think trick or treat, the whole Halloween thing in America is quite big. And so I suppose there are times when it's socially sanctioned to be scared as a child. But psychologically, in the form of stories, I think it's a diminishing thing, and that potentially has consequences. And this links to the notion of loss of transcendence, mythical time. So I'll talk in a second about more in detail about what mythical time might be as the opposite to the eternal now. But this loss of transcendence, art, literature, myths, fairy tales, they take us outside ourselves and they link us to a timeless time that isn't an eternal now, but it's a time, it's a tradition. It's like you'll see an image later on I present of the concept of the sea. It's you're in a sea of time that other people have been in for thousands of years when you have access to traditional narratives. And once you lose that, you're trapped in this here and now. And I think that is one of the causes of the adolescent society's need for myth that we're lacking. And then I used it in the previous video I did, but this is Maze Treaders versus Maze Viewers, which I think has links to Ian McGilchrist's work on left brain, right brain hemispheres. Because what it refers to is this notion that in a labyrinth, when you're in the middle of it, you're quite disorientated. It's the whole purpose of the labyrinth or the maze, and you can't see the overall pattern. So mazes are ambivalent. On the one hand, they have an overarching design and pattern. So Daedalus he was the designer of the myth. But once you're in the middle of it, you can't see the wood for the trees, so to speak, to mix metaphors. You're lost, you're confused, you feel physically completely disorientated. So the ability to see the pattern of the maze versus being in the maze and not being able to see the pattern, that's one of the crucial ambiguities of mazes and labyrinths. And I'm suggesting our society is losing the ability to see patterns because it's insistent upon the explanation of small local things, but refuses to see the complexity of the overall pattern. So I've used this image when I introduced the notion of the labyrinth of loneliness with Octavio Paz in the previous video. So this is just to underline what I was previously saying about getting lost in the maze. So obviously if you're in that, this is why you feel enclosed, you can't see out of it fully. But that's the overarching picture. Now, on a slightly different note, this is the Biosphere 2, it's called. And I think it was finished in 1991. And the idea was there was going to be 2-year missions. I'm sorry to give you such a ridiculous pop culture example, but I think the American TV series Space Force, starring Steve Carell, the guy from the American version of The Office, which isn't as good as the British version, by the way, but anyway. And it refers to, I think, part of the plot. I think they only made 2 series of Space Force. I thought it was slightly better than that. But anyway, they have a little of a parody. But the idea was, I think in the original Biosphere 2, there was a team of 8 people, and they were supposed to live in this artificial environment as almost practice for living on the moon or Mars. And it was an artificial bio environment they designed. So this would be the inside. I think it was based in Oracle, Arizona. So anyone nearby Arizona, go and have a look. But why I'm showing you that is it makes me think of this link between adolescence and adult children. This oxymoron, adult children, basically adults who are delaying the psychological maturity of moving on into adulthood. So this is Ian McGilchrist describing, scientists involved in the Biosphere 2 project were puzzled by the fact that trees within the project repeatedly failed to achieve maturity before they fell over. Later they realized that trees needed wind in order to grow strong. Exposure to winds causes the growth of stress wood, which is the core of the tree's, put my teeth back in, the tree's strength and integrity. Winds also cause the root system to strengthen. So, if you're following me, I'm arguing that adolescents today lack this degree of oppositional wind. They're not challenged, they're indulged, and guess what? They don't develop stress wood. I think I quickly move on because I think the gags write themselves at this point. But Bettelheim says there is a widespread refusal to let children know that the source of much that goes wrong in life is due to our very own natures. The propensity of all men for acting aggressively, asocially, selfishly, out of anger and anxiety. Instead, we want our children to believe that inherently all men are good. But children know that they are not always good, and often, even when they are, they would prefer not to be. This contradicts what they are told by their parents, and therefore makes the child a monster in its own eyes. So at least according to Bettelheim, he's suggesting that, again, it's to do with children being able to access their own unconscious and otherwise uncomfortable feelings. Fairy tales allow you to come to terms with dark ideas. So the adult myth of the Minotaur, I'll be returning to it in depth because with reference to Michael Urton's artwork, because I just think it's one of the most powerful. What could be more id-like in Freudian terms than a labyrinth deep in the ground at which the center there is this monster that's going to eat you, this hybrid half man, half beast that will eat you alive. It's a brilliant description of our innermost fears. But it's put in narrative form to help us. It resonates with us, and you can keep going back to it. But it doesn't definitively explain anything. This is what I was saying earlier. It resonates, it's a resource, it's enigmatic. All the things I think that were lacking in contemporary society. So the deeper inner conflicts originating in our primitive drives and our violent emotions are all denied in much of modern children's literature, and so the child is not helped in coping with them. But the child is subject to desperate feelings of loneliness and isolation, and he often experiences mortal anxiety. More often than not, he is unable to express these feelings in words, or he can do so only by indirection, fear of the dark, of some animal, or anxiety about his body. So I just think anxiety about his body is very apposite for today's gender-fixated times. So in Bettelheim's terms, he's almost in 1976 predicting this inability of children to relate to their own bodies and look at the consequences it's having today. But also of some animal. But rather than, I think it's gone beyond Bettelheim's worst fears. I shouldn't laugh, but because in the UK, there have been, I don't know what it's like in America, but there have been instances in schools where young children have just declared they identify as an animal, and the guidelines were to treat them as if they were that animal. Well, only partly. So, if you identify as a badger, which is, I'm sure someone has in some school, they don't feed them like they'd feed a badger. They give them normal food. So my advice would be take them at their word and give them a few worms and grubs to eat and see how quickly or for how long they want to stay self-identifying as a badger. But I do think Bettelheim's onto something here. And remember, he's writing 1976. But this idea about anxiety about the body or fear of some animal, this is a Michael Urton picture of the Minotaur. So he's an angry Minotaur. So this is Strensky in a brilliant book about, I'll hopefully look at Malinowski in future as well. So much to look at. Myths are not actually meant to be read as explanations, but are active parts of culture. They maintain the legitimacy of our social arrangements. The story of Adam and Eve, for example, may not be literally true, but its literal truth is irrelevant to its function. The story has functioned in the past, among other things, to charter the institutions of wearing clothes, bearing children in pain, or working by the sweat of our brows. So this is whether they're religious parables, whether they're ancient Greek myths, these ideas help structure our traditional thoughts. So the fact that we don't live in paradise, we have to work, childbirth is painful. Unless you're a, committed swinger, most people wear clothes and are thankful that we don't all live on a nudist colony. But all of these have psychological reference points in the story of Adam and Eve. Myths work on us subrationally, below our threshold of awareness. This is what I was saying before, and it links to the first sentence. Myths aren't meant to be read as explanations. So it's almost what myths are denigrated for. So the opening quote by Rollo May, one of the epigraphs of this beginning of the video, the idea that myths are synonymous in our culture with falsehood, when no, according to Malinowski, Strensky, Bettelheim, all these people, the fact that myths are subrational is what makes them quite, powerful. They're offering something that contemporary explanations don't offer. So to give a specific example, one of my favourite in terms of, and maybe I'll do a whole video on this because there are so many variations of the Red Riding Hood myth. So, for example, I think there's a guy, Charles Perrault, French writer, 1697, was it? In his version, Little Red Riding Hood gets eaten up. At the end, there are lots of variations of the Grimm's brothers version. She gets rescued by a hunter. I'm trying to remember this now. In the Grimm's version, I think a grandmother gets eaten by the wolf, she gets eaten by the wolf, and a hunter comes along, and it's like this weird cesarean section operation. They both get released, and then the hunter puts rocks back where they were, and when the wolf wakes up and tries to run away, he dies. That's one version. And there are just so many different versions. There's one version, a French version, that involves Little Red Riding Hood doing a striptease for the wolf. And this is why I'm trying to resist the temptation just to witter on endlessly, because there are so many Freudian, Jungian levels. But one of them is the symbolism of the dark wood and going off the straight path. And you can use your own imaginations at this point what these things might allude to. And then was there a 2004, was it? Shyamalan, was it? He did if you check out the film The Village, and I won't say much more because it'll be a bit of a plot spoiler, but I can see definite parallels with the notion of Little Red Riding Hood in that film, The Village. I can never pronounce his name. I think it's Shyamalan. Anyway. But this is the book illustration. And then there's another one. You couldn't make it up, could you? The artist's name is Warwick Gobble. Or Goble. I don't know if it's pronounced a bit like Michael Bublé, but Goble, Gobble. A very aptly named artist. Now, just to go off on a slight tangent, but it's linked to the theme of adolescence. So in the previous video, The Labyrinth of Loneliness, I looked at this writer, Octavio Paz, and I focused on a particular essay, The Dialectic of Solitude. But this is another essay. So Dialectic of Solitude, I think, was the 9th essay in the collection, and this is the Pachuco and Other Extremes, is the first one. And that's what a Pachuco is. It refers to disaffected Mexican youths in the 1940s and beyond, living mostly in Southern American cities. So the idea is they've been transplanted. To some extent, they don't feel Mexican anymore, and they don't feel American. So Octavio Paz writing about their ambiguous cultural feelings. But it's, if you look up, there's various online descriptions, but the 1943 Zoot Suit riots, because this is what they wore, zoot suits, and the idea, it's an incredibly interesting, complicated story. But these young Mexican-American youths were in places in California, for example, where there were US servicemen. And at the time, so these are disaffected youths, and then you've got people in 1943 preparing for the war effort, and cloth and fabric was rationed to help the war effort. And they walked around in these, obviously, quite a lot of cloth in these outfits. So that contributed to the antipathy with some of the servicemen, and they were just different social perspectives. So there was some quite violent confrontations, hence the Zoot Suit riots. But Path uses these Pachucos as a notion of adolescents rebelling against the dominant society. And I want to just compare and contrast that with contemporary adolescents to provide a bit of distance and perspective. So this is a more modern version. An ode to the colour blue. And much more in keeping with my colour preferences. That is a plume and a half. Not to mention the watch, the watch chain. Yes, that's my average Saturday night get out. But I did mention these were some of the violence that ensued. So these are pictures of a couple of Mexican youths who've been attacked by servicemen. And this is the modern Cholos. This would be, as I know I always think things were better in the past, but you must admit, at least sartorially, I think the Pachucos had it over the Cholos. Grown men in shorts and long white socks, not for me. So I'll hopefully explain to the relevance of all this. Path's notion of adolescent rebellion. All of us at some moment have had a vision of our existence as something unique, untransferable, and very precious. This revelation almost always takes place during adolescence. Self-discovery is above all the realization that we are alone. It's the opening of an impalpable, transparent wall, that of our consciousness between the world and ourselves. It is true that we sense our aloneness almost as soon as we are born, but children and adults can transcend their solitude and forget themselves in games or work. The adolescent, however, vacillates between infancy and youth, halting for a moment before the infinite richness of the world. He's astonished at the fact of his being, and this astonishment leads to reflection as he leans over the river of his consciousness. He asks himself if the face that appears there, disfigured by the water, is his own. The singularity of his being, which is pure sensation in children, becomes a problem and a question. So Octavio Paz here is describing the unique problems and features of adolescence. More so than any other period of our lives, it's this self-absorption, this fear of how others see us, but also not sure of how we see ourselves. And the bit at the end leans over the river of his consciousness. I had to resist the temptation to show you for the umpteenth time the Caravaggio painting of Narcissus, but that is the perfect visual accompaniment to that quote. So I should have showed it you anyway. So what Path's doing, and what's important for my argument here about this quote, he's emphasizing the uniqueness of self-absorption. But, as I'll show you in some subsequent quotes, the Pachucos, at least, it was horrible that they had to, have all this trouble with US servicemen, and there was this antipathy between the two groups. No one wants violent confrontations. But that's indicative of when adolescents rebelled against the existing society, there were consequences. Or they met resistance. It created the stress wood of the trees, in Ian McGilchrist's terms. But I want you to think about how you could contrast this with modern-day adolescents meeting no resistance, to the extent that they're indulged and their wacky ideas about history have become, at least in the UK, the way in which history is now approached in various institutions. People are cancelled. Anything that shows anything vaguely bad about British history has to be apologised for in museums. So it's worse. This rebellious aspect of adolescence that Octavio Paz's referring to has become worse in certain ways today. So to become aware of our history is to become aware of our singularity. It's a moment of reflective repose before we devote ourselves to action again. When we dream that we are dreaming, Novalis wrote, the moment of awaking is at hand. It does not matter then if the answers we give to our questions must be corrected by time. The adolescent is also ignorant of the future changes that will affect the countenance he sees in the water. The mask of an old man is as indecipherable at first glance as a sacred stone covered with occult symbols. It is the history of various amorphous features that can only take shape slowly and vaguely after the profoundest contemplation. Eventually these features are seen as a face, and later as a mask, a meaning, a history. So this is just quite a poetic way of describing what I was talking about earlier as living in an eternal now, which is what adolescents do, because when they're looking at themselves in a mirror, for example, or as Narcissus in the Caravaggio painting, they don't have time to consider the future. They don't have time to consider the past. It's all about them in the here and now, which is fine. As you're growing up to psychological maturity, these are necessary steps. But if as a society we adopt the adolescent attitude to history, that bodes ill for the future. So just to illustrate this with an image I've used once before, I think. But again, this notion of the rejection of history. Past epochs never vanish completely, and blood still drips from all their wounds. Even the most ancient. This is still path, by the way. Sometimes the most remote or hostile beliefs and feelings are found together in one city or one soul, or are superimposed like those pre-Cartesian pyramids that almost always conceal others. So he's referring there to Cortez, one of the original conquistadores, the Spanish colonialists in Mexico. But this reminded me of a quote I've used in the Welcome video, which is one of my favourites. Our cultures, our histories grasp us with 1,000 invisible fingers. The characteristics of individual countries even are of an enormous complexity. The details that give them savour and body, that pull them into one, are often not merely fantastic, but also contradictory. They resemble, rather than a monolith, a conglomerate rock that has been pressed together from a variety of minerals into a tough solidity. Again, each country is inhabited not only by its citizens, but also by ghosts from the past and phantasms from imaginary futures, or saints from lands outside time. So for me, this has also some parallels with Bettelheim's notion of children being able to engage with their subconscious through fairy tales. In Conquest's sense, being able to go back into our own history that's got ghosts and phantasms from imaginary futures or saints from lands outside time, ghosts from the past and phantasms from imaginary futures. In a second, I'm going to develop this notion of time. But this is in complete contrast. These notions of tradition and time over centuries is completely opposite to the adolescent fixation on the present and the rejection of history in all its complexity. So this is a quote from The Maze Maker. And I hope you like it as much as I do, because it might just be my oddness yet again. But I think it's an absolutely stunning description of time that relates to that previous quote from Conquest. So, like I say, I hope you think it's as good as I do. Time is part of the problem. What I mean by time, as I write of it, is the liquid in which legend is suspended. What I write here you will read as though it concerns matters sunk many thousands of years into the past. Yet clearly, I am writing it today. I address you man to man. What I mean by time as I write of it is the liquid in which legend is suspended. I just think that's absolutely stunning. Maybe I need to get out more. In the liquid that contains our communication, there are no problems of depth, nor is the sea measurably bounded. It cannot be plumbed, and soundings taken in it are illusory. You who hang high in these tidal waters, where there seems to be light, may look up and see in the blue cavern, which becomes the darkness of space, shreds of cloud moving across the sky. Or you may look down and discern the shifting shreds of memory, swaying like weeds in the darkness of the deep past. It is for you to decide which way up you hang, because you too swim suspended in this solution of memory and are dragged about capriciously by the tides. I just think it's a great image of this suspension of time, but it's shared time. across the centuries, across the millennia. In stark opposition to this, all these subtleties and nuances that Ayrton's described of the light conditions in the water that he's using as a metaphor, compared to this brash neon light that not just adolescents but everyone seems to be inundated with these days. And I've used this in the Instagram angst video, The Maze of the Selfie, I think the subtitle was. But this is Jorge Luis Borges, The House of Asterion, and it's describing the Minotaur in the labyrinth, and basically he's bored. And one of the interesting sub-themes in what is quite a short story is part of the Minotaur's boredom and existential ennui is that he's illiterate. He doesn't read, like most adolescents these days. And Borges has a brilliant way of conveying the sterility, the empty vacuity of a life without literature. So this is the Minotaur speaking. I'm not interested in what one man may transmit to other men. I think that nothing is communicable by the art of writing. That should be the motto for TikTok or Instagram. I think that nothing is communicable by the act of writing, the art of writing. Bothersome and trivial details have no place in my spirit, which is prepared for all that is vast and grand. I have never retained the difference between one letter and another. A certain generous impatience has not permitted that I learn to read. Sometimes I deplore this, for the nights and days are long. The house here is referring to the labyrinth he lives in. All parts of the house are repeated many times. Any place is another place. The house is the same size as the world, or rather, it is the world. Perhaps I've created the stars and the sun and this enormous house, but I no longer remember. And I think that's this was written in the 1940s from memory, but I think it's a great preemptive description of the emptiness of cyberspace. But this is Octavio Paz, back to him, talking about the Pachucos. Their attitude reveals an obstinate, almost fanatical will to be, but this will affirms nothing specific except their determination. It is an ambiguous one, as we shall see, not to be like those around them. Since the Pachuco cannot adapt himself to a civilization which for its part rejects him, he finds no answer to the hostility surrounding him, except this angry affirmation of his personality. Now, in the title, I've put then and now, and I'm making the link to the Biodome, the Biosphere 2 project, because at least when Path was writing about the Pachucos, they had this Stresswood situation where they could rebel against the existing society. I'm suggesting how much worse is it when modern-day adolescents don't even have that resistance? So all you're left with is the angry affirmation of your personality, or the ever more involved and self-absorbed description of your identity and what specific pronouns everyone has to use when you enter a room. And rather than, again, I think we live in times worse than Pachucos, not to be like those around them. At least the Pachucos had a brilliant dress sense, and they wanted to look deliberately different. Think about the bovine conformity that dominates online atmospheres now. And, some superannuated basketball player will release a new line of sneakers, and people will sleep out overnight to buy a pair. Oh, I feel a rage coming on, so quickly moving on. Again, this is Path. Man is alone everywhere, but the solitude of the Mexican under the great stone night of the high plateau that is still inhabited by insatiable gods is very different from that of the North American, who wanders in an abstract world of machines, fellow citizens, and moral precepts. In the Valley of Mexico, man feels himself suspended between heaven and earth, and he oscillates between contrary powers and forces, and petrified eyes and devouring mouths. Reality, that is the world that surrounds us, exists by itself here, has a life of its own, and was not invented by man as it was in the United States. The Mexican feels himself to have been torn from the womb of this reality, which is both creative and destructive, both mother and tomb. He has forgotten the word that ties into all those forces through which life manifests itself. Therefore, he shouts or keeps silent, stabs or prays, falls asleep for 100 years. And that last falls asleep for 100 years reminds me of the later novel by the Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude. And I'd be interested whether Marquez partly took that title from this quote. But just to emphasize, he's talking in terms of the Mexican versus the North American. Remember, this is 1949, he wrote it, 1950 it was published. So arguably, Mexico's developed quite rapidly, and these distinctions aren't as sheer. And I don't think he's being anti-American. He's more using being North American as a metonym or a shorthand to represent developed Western society that's turned its back on tradition. And Mexico has a much more complex history because the conquistadores grafted Spanish culture on top of indigenous Indian culture in a way that the founding fathers didn't in North America. They basically created a whole new culture, not from scratch. It was obviously influenced by British culture, but they had the space, the time, and the ingenuity to create a whole new constitution and a whole new way, the pursuit of happiness and liberty. Of course, there are indigenous people in North America at the time, but for various complex historical reasons, that indigenous Indian presence has not continued or coexisted like it has in Mexico. And it just isn't long enough to go into the reasons why, but one modern example, again to give you a topical or vaguely topical example, the TV series Breaking Bad. There's a couple of minor characters who are Mexican hitmen twins who wear these incredibly loud suits. Definitely not zoot suits. But they pray and they crawl on their knees to these gods that are hybrid Catholic and indigenous, the way these religions have melded together. And it's quite obvious it's quite different to North American culture, this Mexican hybrid. And the notion of devouring mouths, it took me back to the Little Red Riding Hood. But this is, again, the notion of a life that's still inhabited by insatiable gods, pagan gods, traditional notions that address our subconscious. And if I've said the North American idea is a shorthand for Western developed society in general, but likewise Path's use of the notion of the Mexican could be seen as any traditional culture that's been completely displaced by modern technology. And at the end he said, therefore he shouts or keeps silent, stabs or prays or falls asleep for 100 years. And just to give a slight visual representation of what happens when you lose access to the unconscious, or what happens when you're living the North American dream. I think this picture I'm going to show you by Michael Urton represents what's left behind and not acknowledged, but is still there in the background. I think it's a really powerful image. But the sense of enclosure, the sense of being trapped. This is the psychological, unconscious qualities that traditional culture, indigenous culture tends to address. And the ancient Greek myths, as here, addressed. But increasingly, modern adolescent society doesn't. So I'm beginning to sum up now. Our solitude has the same roots as religious feelings. It's a form of orphanhood, an obscure awareness that we have been torn from the all, and an ardent search, a flight and a return, an effort to re-establish the bonds that unite us with the universe. Nothing could be further from this feeling than the solitude of the North American. In the United States, man does not feel that he has been torn from the centre of creation and suspended between hostile forces. He has built his own world, and it is built in his own image. It is his mirror. But now he cannot recognise himself in his human objects, nor in his fellows. His creations, like those of an inept sorcerer, no longer obey him. He is alone among his works, lost in a wilderness of mirrors. I just wanted to make the link with the previous talk I did on the philosophy and psychology of mirrors. This reflection of the same thing in modern society doesn't have the resonance or the depth of myth or fairy tale. The North American system only wants to consider the positive aspects of reality. Men and women are subjected from childhood to an inexorable process of adaptation. Certain principles contained in brief formulas are endlessly repeated by the press, the radio, the churches, and the schools. A person imprisoned by these schemes is like a plant in a flower pot, too small for it. He cannot grow or mature. This sort of conspiracy cannot help but provoke violent individual rebellions. Spontaneity avenges itself in 1,000 subtle or terrible ways. The mask that replaces the dramatic mobility of the human face is benevolent and courteous, but empty of emotion. And its set smile is almost lugubrious. It shows the extent to which intimacy can be devastated by the arid victory of principles over instincts. And that last phrase, intimacy can be devastated by the arid victory, just reminds me of the video I did on Bebop and Baudrillard and the reference to Lily Phillips. Did I say Bebop? I'm sorry, the Bop House. I think I'm thinking about something else. But the idea that the number of sex acts is now a way in which in contemporary society intimacy has become devastated. But to finish on a slightly brighter note, I want to give you a couple of visual illustrations of some of the points provided in this long quote. This idea that we live now according to formulas. The theme throughout this video has been we've replaced the enigmatic and the ambiguous with the formulaic. And I think these concluding couple of images illustrate that quite well. So the first one you should all be familiar with. And then I'll contrast this with what I believe is called trout pout. Because apparently, because the influencers tell us, this is what is attractive. Lips like a toilet plunger. And on that life-affirming note, I hope you enjoyed the video. All the very best until the next time. Goodbye.